Now that we've made our first history bounding skirt, we of course need a shirtwaist to go with it. So today we're going to complete our first history bounding look. And since I've received so many requests for this, if you stay tuned to the end, I will formally introduce you to the bunnies. To make our first history bounding top, I've tried to pick something that wasn't too complicated or involved, something that would be a really easy first time make. I think I was mostly successful, but I do have a couple complaints about this pattern that I'll go over as we get to them. For this top, I used the Sensibility Patterns 1908 Beatrice Shirtwaist pattern. Since it's a very loose fitting top that's intended to blouse out in the front, there's not a lot of fitting involved. It does require you to set in sleeves, but I found that those went quite easily. And since it only has French seams and bias bound seams, there's no hand felling or need for complicated hand sewing. As you can see, I've made the simpler version, with no insertion lace or whitework embroidery, but I definitely encourage you to make the more complicated versions. If I make a future version, this is definitely one of the changes I will make. This pattern has options for front and back closures and various versions of sleeve poofiness and length. I wanted something I could get into and out of easily, so I picked the front closure. And I don't really love big poofy sleeves, so I picked the slim long sleeve pattern. Since I chose to make my shirtwaist out of this calico cotton muslin, I didn't make a mock-up. If I needed to make fit changes, the cost of the fabric was the same whether I used this or my regular cotton mock-up fabric, so I decided to go with this. If you are using a nicer fabric, don't do this, make a mock-up. The one fit change I would make for myself is taking in the sides a bit, but since it's supposed to be fairly loose, I left it as it is. I am rather short-waisted and found that the waist sat pretty much where it was supposed to be. So if you're taller than me, I'm just under 5'1", or longer waisted than I am, you'll probably need to make this change at the lengthen or shorten line, but I didn't have to do anything. And now, take it away, voiceover Francis. This is an E pattern, so your first instruction will be to print off your pattern pieces and tape them all together. Doing this in Adobe is not hard, but it is also not intuitive. However, the pattern does have a good walkthrough for how to correctly print out your pieces and join them. Take care to join them on the registration mark created by the printer. One quick hint, the large sheets of pattern can become unwieldy. Cut the pieces once you have whole pieces assembled, rather than waiting until you have the whole 25 pages taped together. I chose to cut up this pattern since it is easy enough to reprint and reassemble. I like to do this step while my fabric is pre-washing and drying. After pre-washing your fabric, which you will need to do for anything you will want to be able to wash later, press it. Even if you did the wrinkle remover cycle in the dryer, it will still need to be pressed. Since this pattern is cut with the fabric folded in half, press the full width, then fold the fabric in half lengthwise, matching the selvages, and press to the center. This helps to give you a neat fold to work with. Now you are ready to lay out your pattern pieces. This pattern has a couple of different layout options based on whether you are making the front or back closure version. Use the layout diagram appropriate to your version. Carefully trace the pattern pieces onto the fabric, taking care to preserve all marks and pattern notches. I like to do this in pencil on light fabrics since it is a light mark that won't bleed and is on the seam allowance anyway. When I'm laying out my pattern pieces, I measure from the grain line on the pattern to the selvage to ensure that the pattern is on grain all the way across the pattern piece. That presented some difficulty on this pattern. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. So I want to stop here for a minute to talk about these pattern pieces. And I'm going to start by saying that making patterns is no small feat. And I haven't done it, so I only have so much leg to stand on. But there's something really frustrating I found about this pattern piece, and I wanted to point it out for those of you following along. So these here are grain lines, and all of the pieces have them, as we'd expect. But they actually aren't correct in most of the pieces. For example, because this fold line and this grain line aren't parallel, there is no way to make this piece be both correctly on the fold and correctly on the grain line, unless you refold your pattern. But I can't imagine that they actually meant you to be sort of 3 or 4 degrees off the grain line on the bias here. It's the same with this piece, which I found particularly frustrating because this is a straight line and this is a straight line, and we had lots of lines to go off, but this is actually slightly off angle. And so if you do like you're supposed to do and take your ruler and measure this to your selvage or your fold to get the perfect grain line, you're going to be a little bit off the grain on cutting your tie pieces. And normally when we cut tie pieces, we want them to be on the grain. So this really doesn't make sense. I suspect from the way this pattern looks that this was actually drawn in magic marker or something and then scanned in. So they just drew a line, but it's a little bit frustrating that they didn't take a ruler, mark it parallel, because I can't imagine that they meant this to be a couple of degrees on the bias on a tie. That would do wonky things to your shaping. Same with your collar. Okay, rant over. I did not refold my pattern pieces or measure off of the wonky grain lines. Instead, I cut the collar on the fold and measured the tie on the parallel outer and center lines. For the rest of the pieces, I lined up the edges I knew needed to be on grain, like the center front, with the selvage. The back was on the fold, so I just used that. The sleeves, I just used the grain line and hoped for the best. So the instructions for the pattern tell you that this is our collar piece and you should run the gathering stitches on the front or do your pin tucks and then sew your front and back together. However, that's for the back closure version and we're doing the front closure version. So we're going to change it up a little because I think this is going to be a lot easier to manage. So what we're going to do is, these are our front closure pieces and this is our back closure piece, is we're going to sew the front to the back and the shoulders together like we're supposed to using French seams. And then we're going to measure this collar against our collar piece here and our front collar pieces. And we're going to do our pin tucks according to the size they would need to be to fit into this collar piece. That's going to be a lot easier to measure on this front closure garment than it would be to try and do it this way with this collar piece. Feel free to do it either way, but I think that especially if you've never tried to kind of put a collar in before like this will be easier. This is a lot like on our last project when we gathered the skirt to fit the waistband. We're basically doing the same thing here. We're just doing it with pin tucks. And you can do it with gatherings. The instructions say gathers or pin tucks. I just like pin tucks better. We'll be using French seams to sew this together, so I'm going to give you a quick tutorial. To do this, you sew your two pieces wrong sides together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. For those unfamiliar, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance amounts to a seam sewn just to the inside of the 1/4 inch mark. If you have a piecing foot, the guide is a scant 1/4 inch, since this is the most commonly used seam in quilting. You will notice here that I have been trying to get into the habit of marking my seam allowances in pencil. This is much easier to do before you have pinned your pieces together, but if you forget, just go ahead and mark over the pins. Once you have sewn your scant 1/4 inch seam, press and turn the fabric so that it is right sides together, and then sew another seam, this time with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This way, your seam amounts to 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press. Before you do this, remember to cut off any pattern notches along that side of the fabric. Otherwise, they will stick out of your French seam. Now that you have sewn your French seam, you have encased your seam allowance and the seam is finished. This is great for quickly finishing seams, but can be challenging or impossible on curved seams. Also, you will do this wrong at some point and end up with your French seam on the outside. It's okay. There are very few places in sewing where you sew a seam with wrong sides together. Right sides together is just habit. Take a deep breath and spend some quality time with your seam ripper. After you finish this process for the two shoulder seams, repeat for the two side seams. I found that the side seams on the front and the back were not the same length. I checked my sizes and pattern pieces in cutting. Finally, I walked the two pattern pieces to see if they fit together as drawn. Spoiler alert, they don't. My suggestion here is match up the center notch and pin out from there. After finishing the side seams, you can cut off the little bit of extra in the arm side and just take care of the bottom when it comes time to hem. But this was super frustrating. The instructions for making the collar are pretty clear and straightforward. Sew together, clip, and turn. But we aren't going to attach it just yet. If you haven't already marked your shirt front for the button plackets, do so now. I did this lightly in pencil on the fold line. Follow the instructions to press under. The instructions never say when or how to sew the placket down, or if they did, I couldn't find it. Since I cannot imagine the pins were meant to be permanent, I had to do some digging on how this would have been done historically. An internet search didn't turn up much, but I do have one extant Edwardian blouse with front closures, so I looked at how it was done on that. As an aside, if there's interest, I'm considering doing a video on exactly how to do this kind of research. Let me know in the comments if you'd like that. Anyway, my extant piece has the placket sewn down at 1/8 of an inch with a top stitch, so that's what I did here. Now we are going to attach the collar. To do this, find the middle point on the back of the shirt and mark it with a pin. Then do the same with the raw edge of the collar. Ease the shirt into the collar, taking care only to pin the underside of the collar. The top side will get turned under and felled in place in a minute. Here is another place where I was disappointed with this pattern. I was hoping to have enough shirt front to do at least a couple of pin tucks, but using the front closure line for my size, I didn't. Again, I checked the pattern sizing and my cutting, but they were correct. The pattern just didn't leave enough extra to do pin tucks on the front, so none for me. Sew the collar on, clip, turn, and press. Then fold the top side of the collar edge under. And using small felling stitches, also called whip stitches, secure the collar, encasing the seam. Once your collar is done, it is time to attach your sleeves. First, you are going to sew gathering stitches along the sleeve head. I like to do this and my basting in a color that stands out so that I know which threads need to be pulled out later. Run 2 rows of gathering stitches on each sleeve. Then repeat your French seam process to sew the long edge of the sleeve. You should have a long tube. Pin the sleeve into the arm side with the right side of the sleeve to the right side of the blouse, starting at the underarm seams. Gather the sleeve to fit, then sew on, this time with a regular seam. Instead of the French seam, you will use bias binding here. To create your bias tape, you're going to take leftover fabric and create 1.5 inch strips on a 45-degree angle to the selvage. The length doesn't matter too much here because you are going to sew all the pieces end to end, but I try not to bother with the really short pieces. Sew your bias strips together, end to end, right sides together at a 45-degree angle. I chain piece mine, which is when you don't cut the threads between each new piece. Just lift up the presser foot, pull out a bit of tail, and start on the new pieces. Once you have finished with the whole length, cut your threads and trim your seam allowances down to a 1/4 inch. Press all seam allowances in the same direction. Here you can do one of two things. If you want to do a Hong Kong finish, you can just sew the bias tape on at 1/4 inch seam allowance, matching the raw edges. Press it and fold over, making sure the raw edge extends past your stitch line. Then stitch in the ditch along the bias tape. Here I did sort of a weird hybrid of the two methods where I sewed it on, folded in half, and then folded the raw edge under. It worked, but one of the other finishes will be neater. Your other option is to make bias tape and attach it. There are lots of great tutorials, so I'm not going to recreate one. This is the more historically accurate way, and I sort of fake recreated it with my folding under thing here. To enclose the raw edge on the bias tape, I just folded the exposed end under 1/4 of an inch before sewing the bias tape down. Before you hem the sleeves, you want to attach the ties and sew down the button plaque so that you can make sure it's sitting properly when you determine your sleeve length. To attach the ties, I found was fairly straightforward, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Just make sure they're pointing the correct way when you sew them down, otherwise it'll be hard to tie it in the front. Next, I did the bottom hem. To do this, start by folding the bottom edge of your shirt under 1/4 of an inch. Press well. This will make the finished hem much neater, especially since you are sewing a curved hem. Then fold under 3/8 of an inch and press again. Pin in place. When sewing, make sure to use the bottom edge of your shirt as the guide. This way your hemline will be an even distance from the bottom of the shirt all the way around. It will look much neater. Now is the time to attach your buttons and sew your buttonholes. The pattern says to use as many buttons as you want, so just take care that they are evenly spaced. I used a button with a shank, so just went through the hole in the shank and the fabric several times until I was sure it was secure. For my buttonholes, I used my machine's automatic buttonholer. Every buttonholer is different, so I'm not going to go through how to use mine. It is unlikely to help you. If you don't have a buttonholer, you can sew them by hand. Either way you do it, again take care to make sure they are even in length and spacing, and that your spacing matches up with your buttons. If they don't, remember that it is easier to move the button than the buttonhole. Also, work your button through the hole a couple of times before you put the shirt on. This will make it much easier to take off. I did do a different spacing on the collar because I liked the effect of the 2 buttons rather than just one. After this, try on your shirt and check your sleeve length. Do this with your arm relaxed and hanging naturally by your side. Once you have decided where you would like the sleeve to end, mark it with a pin. Leave yourself at least 5/8 of an inch. You will do this the same way you did your shirt hem. If you need to hem the sleeve more than 5/8 of an inch, you can either cut off the excess or adjust how much you fold under. Just take care to use the same measurements on both sleeves. Again, use the bottom edge of the sleeve as your guide to get a level hem. Now that we've finished our shirtwaist, it's time to start wearing our first history bounding outfit. Overall, I'm happy with the fit, though as I mentioned in the introduction, I could have taken a bit out of the sides. Also, if I make another one, I think I'd choose a lighter weight fabric, like a cotton lawn. This fabric is serviceable and fine, but I just think it'd be prettier in something a little more flowy. I also need a bit more practice with my machine's buttonholer, or to start hand sewing my buttonholes. All of that being said, I'm thrilled with my first history bounding outfit and excited that we all have an outfit we can finally wear, one that we've made ourselves. So how is your history bounding wardrobe going? We know that I've got my first outfit, but I want to know about yours. Have you made this shirtwaist? Are you trying a different first shirt or top? If you're making your own history bounding wardrobe, capsule or otherwise, or just a beginner trying to take on making your own clothes and costuming, hit subscribe for more videos like this. I'm trying to pack this with beginner content and ways to make it easier for you. Also, as I've said in all my videos, if you have other questions or comments or things you'd like to see videos on, let me know. I'm trying to be responsive to those. And now for the part you've all actually been waiting for, meeting the bunnies. As you may have seen in my previous videos, I am the devoted human servant of 2 adorable little bunnies. This one is the Lady Elizabeth Honeysuckle Mountbatten McCottontail, or Honeysuckle when she is at home. Her husband is Mr. Benjamin T. Wombat, known to most as Wombat. She is a tricolored Dutch and he is a chinchilla. In terms of personality, she is a fussy criminal mastermind who will stop at nothing for cookies, and he's really just happy to be here. They are both about 3 years old and rescues who came from neglect situations, but are now living their bunny best life with us. She's been with us about 18 months, and we got him about 6 months ago. And with that, I will bid you adieu. I remain, as ever, your faithful servant and 21st century Victorian, Frances Worthington.